Hi, welcome to Exploring the Illusion of Free Will. My name is George. I'm here with my co-hosts Nomi and John, and we have as our special guest Dr. Kurt Johnson. And today we're going to explore exactly what we mean by the term free will. Then from within that context, we can discuss whether or not we have one or not. Okay, gentlemen. So basically, the conventional shared meaning of free will is that what we do is up to us. That regardless of our genes, regardless of our education, of where we grew up, how we were raised, and all, we can decide at any moment for ourselves apart from that. So that's the general. So which essentially makes us like Shakespeare said, Hamlet's we're players, in a play, or like robots or automatons. That everything we're basically conditioned to do and say whatever we do. So what is John? Kurt, what's your impression of that?
Well, actually, I'm going to go back to some of the side conversations that we've had, because one of the things we discovered is that if we didn't explore what we meant by some of these terms, we weren't really having a meaningful discussion. And I think at least three of us, and probably all of us, agree that there's not the type of free will that's isolated from any type of preconditioning. That's just not the case. So there's conditioned free will, there's relative free will, there are systems of causality where one thing is setting up conditions that then allows for an array of possibilities after that. But I think where it gets tricky, and I want to even go back to the biological organism here, is that, for instance, everything in the body is going to, again, be determined by the cause and effect around the mean of the bell curves and developmental pathways. But in genetics, there's the chance for mutation. And the chance for mutation, which is something that is completely out of the box and then can happen, and then can actually predict other things happening, like a cancerous tumor, where a cancerous tumor is actually a large body of cells that set up a new set of rules outside the constraints that were set up before them. So I think what I'm saying, and I'm hearing reflecting in all of this, is that we're in a dialectic here between both of these things being true.
Okay, Naomi, what's your take on it?
Yeah, the conventional idea of free will is that if one has one can choose A, one could have also done B, and the causal equations that are at the back of choosing A would not matter. So, but I think we all agree that will is caused by processes, by factors, by laws of the universe, what has gone before in time. But sometimes I think the discussion goes beyond time. It goes meta discourse sometimes, and I think we start meaning different things by the same term. And so I think we all agree that will is causal, right?
I think so. John, what's your take?
Anybody else?
I'm sort of still confused about it, so I hope this conversation will enlighten me.
Sure.
I believe in constrained will. I think I've used this analogy before. I am free to create novel sentences, and you are free to understand them or reject them or not, but we have that understanding. But I don't know the laws of grammar while I'm speaking. I'm not thinking about that at all. So that's largely unconscious. So there's a vast background knowledge that that's available to us. And I can study the laws of grammar. But it's also like when you play a piece of music, you're not thinking about every note. You already know what those relationships are.
Right.
That's a different level, I think, that's operating.
So let's
so we're
explore
not
this.
totally free. I think all freedom has constraints built into it.
Right, and let's explore this within a specific example. Kurt, like using your definition of free will, present, let's say, a thought or a choice that you might make that you would consider partially free, conventionally free, and then we can explore it in terms of like what you mean by that and whether it actually pans out.
Yeah, I'll do that. But I also just want to suggest one thing as a background here, is that, and we had this discussion earlier, that in looking at these types of problems or paradoxes, there are monological ways to look at it which set down fixed parameters and then have a discourse. from classical philosophy or whatever it would be. And then there are dialogical parameters, which would be saying this is a dynamic system, and let's learn about how to talk about a dynamic system. And a lot of science right now is in an interplay between monological inquiry and analysis and dialogical inquiry and analysis. So I just want to say that we're not acting in isolation here. Science is also just dealing with these different ways of approaching problems. So anyway, like for instance, when we were at lunch, I said a good example of that would be whether I decide to watch the Jet-Steelers game on Sunday. And I think you pointed out very well that even though it's true that I would say that I have the choice to watch it or not, I could probably imagine all kinds of pathways of conditioning that would have contributed to what decision I actually make. But it would be interesting to play a game with myself and say at the last minute, because of this discussion today, I would decide to do the opposite of what my intention actually was. And so that just further brings more subtlety into this play of what actually caused what and what are the pathways that determined that volitional act. And I love Nomi defined volition earlier from Spinoza, right? Yeah. And it was, again, that it's in relation to a pathway that results in something that you've decided actually becoming an action. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of subtleties involved.
All right, but are you describing that decision to watch the Steelers game or not as partly free? Is that?
I'd go with John's definition. It's constrained free will. In other words, I can make a certain decision, but there's no doubt that it's been influenced by multiple pathways of input.
And I'm also curious about the metaphor that you came up with. You talked about Shakespeare, and we're all players. Or are we zombies? I think that's a metaphor, and I am repelled by the idea that we are zombies. And I don't think a zombie is a very adequate metaphor. Being a player, though, even in a play by Shakespeare, where all the lines have been composed already, there's an openness to every performance. And we go see Hamlet over and over and over again with different performers because there's a pattern, a template there that I do think is predetermined. But how you direct it, how you perform in it, that unique happening that night, those are lots of different variables. And a zombie does not, or automaton does not capture that. I would go with the player
okay.
if I were.
John, before, there's different ways of describing, like, the nature of our will as being, like, predetermined in the sense that we're, like we could be robots, automatons, players. I prefer zombies. When you use the word zombie, what is your exact definition of it?
Well, when I hear someone like Daniel Dennett, who's a neurocomputational guy, or Patricia Churchland, who says we're all zombies. There's nothing there except neurons firing.
And I
think that's bullshit.
I agree with you because, like, basically, we want when you use a term like that that disparages, it's pejorative like that. Certainly, we're not going to feel good about it.
But more important, it reduces the complexity of the human being to it's the brain that causes consciousness, and I reject that idea. I think consciousness is.
Okay,
it can't be reduced to any. I do think there's a relationship, and a very important relationship between brain, mind, consciousness, self.
Let's go back to the exploration. So you're saying that it's not completely free, it's partially free.
Right.
Okay, so then what part of that decision would you consider free?
Well, I want to bring in an interesting parallel here, and I'll jump to that, and that's David Hawkins' book, Subjectivity and Reality. And this is where he takes paradigms and he talks about all the people who were working within that paradigm, be it an artistic paradigm, a paradigm in physics, and then he points to the one or two people who broke out of that paradigm and became the evolvers of the next paradigm shift. And he's then asking this same question. In other words, what was the degree of freedom in those thinkers that he shows in each of these paradigms that allowed them to have fully experienced all the constraints of that paradigm, but yet be compelled in some way to think freely in some new way that allowed them to step outside that box and do something new. I think that's the same type of freedom in a cultural and historic sense that I'm talking about when I say at the last minute, will I decide to watch the Jet-Steelers game or not? I mean, there's a tweak at some point. Now, that's also true in the body. When a mutation happens in the body, which could then even result in a tumor, which is living in its own free way because it's not obeying what the RNA is telling it to do. I mean, a tumor ends up killing you because the RNA signals that are saying, oh, obey the rules of the developmental pathway, obey the rules of what you're supposed to be doing in this part of the tissue, they don't pay attention. So, it's really the same kind of thing. What is that tweak?
All right, well, Kurt, let me pull you back though. Okay, the question I asked is like you said that the decision to watch the Steelers game or not was partially free. Then I asked you what part of that decision was free.
I think whether or not just to turn the TV set on at the last moment, where I actually it becomes volitional. Do I turn the set on or not?
Okay. Well, let John, before let's just explore this. Let's explore this line of reasoning. Whether to see what Kurt is saying when he means free. Okay, like so you say the actual decision was free. Now then, when you ask yourself why you made the decision, what would be your answer then?
Well, no, I would agree with you that if I went into an analysis of that final tweak, there would be other sets of conditions. So we're never going to be free of micro conditions. But I think we're also not going to we're not going to lose our creativity either. We're going to be in this dialectic.
Can I ask a question? Sure. You talk about the tweak and the analysis of the tweak, and earlier I was talking about synchronistic events, like the bird pooping on my head, and that interior question and that exterior experience, which I'm calling synchronistic. I think synchronicities are happening all the time. There's some of these anomalies that pop up and strike us as unusual. But is there a relationship, do you think, between the tweak and those kinds of synchronicities?
I would say absolutely yes, yeah. Because I don't think we can, in the subtle realms of what we're experiencing, there's so many things at play. I think there's a thing in Ken Wilber where he says, even arbitrarily, if you do a diagram of the dialogical relationships of I, we, it, and its, there are 72 possibilities for any act that you would possibly do. And even in the sense of what you're aware of, you're probably picking from a menu of maybe 10 or 12 of those 72 at most. And yet they're all there as possibilities. Yeah.
And another question, since you're a biologist, you're a good person to ask, about the tweak and the synchronicity and the birth of species. Now, you need a male and a female, right, to get a species started?
Well, actually, species come from gene pools. So that means that there's nothing that doesn't evolve from a population. So everything is the shift of populations to new statistical means of what they look like, what their needs are, where they live, and what characterizes them. If you really think through time, you could ask, what's a species? If everything's been evolving vertically through time, where's been the break between any species? It doesn't exist. So even the idea of species in the present time horizontally, different kinds of birds, we recognize those now in horizontal now time, but every one of those has a lineage, and they actually end up converging on each other back in time, so that they were never separate.
Gentlemen, I want to pull it back. John, you introduced the idea of synchronicity as applying to this question of whether our will can be free in some sense. Nomi, could you address that, how synchronicity might or might not play a role in determining whether a decision might be free of the compelling influences or not?
I would say that synchronicity could come from some quantum dynamic. But I would say that even then, if it is coming from a quantum dynamic, it is still determined by the quantum dynamic. And we can't say that, we are causing it in some way. I mean, for me, the quantum determinism is itself a determinism of which we are not actually responsible.
Yeah, let me just mention this. Your example is really great because the synchronicity that actually happens in nature is between what the gene pool does and what natural selection selects. So the gene pool is actually experimenting with a lot of ways that an organism can be. It can be taller, it can be shorter, it can eat this, it can eat that. But then the synchronicity is what does the environment choose in the sense of survival for what actually takes that direction. So it's amazing that evolution itself is this synchronicity between what the genome's doing and then what nature is allowing to survive.
So it's a relationship, a dance between
Absolutely.
them. It's not a top-down
Absolutely.
management decision about how it's going to go.
And actually, even in biology, the studies of biology are really broken down into macroevolution and microevolution. Microevolution studies the givens that the genome presents as opportunities, and macroevolution is about what the environment then does to select which of those actually become a direction. So I think that's interesting as a background here.
Okay, so the question then becomes, how exactly would synchronicity lend an opening to free will? You know, because by my reasoning is that there is the kind of a sequential causal reality that's very proximate. That, you know, my hand holds this paper. It's very proximate, okay? But then there's an underlying universal causality that means that, for example, the state of the universe at the moment of the Big Bang was completely responsible for the state of the universe at the next moment. And then that state of the universe was completely responsible for the next moment. So in terms of relating this to synchronicity, you might have two things that seem kind of like, that are connected, and that would seem to explain it, that they're basically being guided by the same universal causality.
But is it one moment responsible for the next, or one moment influences the next?
Well,
that's a very subtle difference, I think.
Think about it. Let's consider the entirety of the universe, and you know, when we consider this, there gets to be a point where logic, it transcends logic. In other words, like, how could the universe be finite? How could it be infinite? You know. But to our knowledge of the entire state of the universe, if it's going from one state to the next, you know, moment by moment, one individual moment, then wouldn't the prior moment have to completely determine, you know, if it's the entire universe, the subsequent
I think actually you get in the danger of a linguistic trap, which is what I think John's pointing to. And let's go back again to mutation. If down a developmental pathway, and this would be almost like your Big Bang, you know that there's this possibility for a mutation, which is some new genetic combination which has never occurred before, and therefore determines another set of pathways. If you then ask the question, was that tweak, that sudden change, determined completely by what came before? I think that's a discussion that's full of traps. And a good example in physics is when they say there was an equal amount of antimatter and matter at the beginning, and now we're mostly matter and there's not that much antimatter. Then this question is, what happened to tilt that? One of the big questions in physics, what tilted that balance? So in other words, if everything again was predetermined down a pathway, it would predict actually that there would be as much matter as antimatter, and that's not the case. So I think that, you know, there's a question along the factual lines here, and then there's the question along the dialogical and linguistic traps we fall into in talking about.
But mutation is in the cards. There are laws which will allow for mutation, isn't it?
Because they're combinations. They're mathematical combinations. They're like a card game. Or like writing music, that you could, there's an infinite number of songs you can write from notes on that staff. That's exactly the way the genome works. But new combinations, well, this would be your question, are they new?
Right, and
Are
exactly,
new combinations new?
because then we would have to ask, well, how do they arise? There must be a reason for their arising. And once we ask that question, once we ask how they arise, then that describes causality. You know, they arrived for some reason. We may not know. It may be completely inexplicable to us. But there must be some reason for the mutation, for whatever change.
Yeah, in other words, I think you could say that if you could really examine the subtle realms, you could come up with some type of developmental pathway that would predetermine why that certain new mathematical combination happened. So that, again, I'm kind of warning us not to build traps, you know, build things that might not be there. I mean, why is that a problem? Why is that a problem?
Well, my point is that if the unexplained phenomenon that doesn't fit within our context has a reason and is causal, then certainly that would preclude free will just as completely as our conventional understanding that we fully understand.
Well, it would preclude a kind of free will that you're defining in a very absolute way. If we went down to your definition of free will, it's not a problem, because you said it in the beginning. You said it's what?
Constrained.
Constrained free will.
Okay, John. So let's.
I call it constrained will.
Constrained will.
Right.
Oh.
We have desires, we have ambitions, we have wants,
But
we have strategies for getting those. That, I think, is the conventional view of what free will is about. And it's our daily experience that we don't always get what we want. So it's
okay,
we then say, well, maybe it's all predetermined.
You say
I
we
couldn't
have a
get it.
constrained will. Okay, so like then, by my understanding, if it's constrained, is it fully constrained or is it partly up to us and then partly constrained?
Well, that's where the tweak is.
That's where the
So,
tweak
all right,
is.
so
That's
so
the
then-
big question mark. It's
all
a
right, so
very
let's put it to
interesting-
the
unanswered
test.
question.
Let's put it to the test. Come up with a choice and present to us the unconstrained aspect of that choice that was freely made.
Well, I can talk about daily life, and I think I've used this before. If I want to go across, if I live in Manhattan and I want to get safely across town, there are traffic lights and there are signs that say walk, don't walk, stop, go. Because I'm constrained by those signs and agreements have been made by others that we're going to follow these signs,
Right, but no-
I can travel safely. Okay?
No, but we're talking about you're talking
But I'm
about
just
like
saying
a
there's
legal constraint.
constraints. In order to travel safely, there are constraints.
No, I understand the constraint part.
That I obey.
No, I know, John. I understand the constraint part. Okay, what I don't understand is you say that there is a free will that is free of those constraints. So the question to you would
Well,
be.
there are traffic jams and there are breakdowns in communication, and people do get hit by cars because they may have gone out and had too much to drink, and that I understand happens very often.
Again,
So I'm just saying that's the tweak.
Yeah, and I'm wondering why we're searching to pin a label on a dynamic phenomenon and then asking, is it true or not true? That's kind of the problem I have with this discussion. In other words, if we're kind of playing pin the tail on the donkey here, and the tail is free will, is there or is there not free will? I'm not sure that that's actually a valid discussion in a dynamic matrix. Stuff is happening. Yes, it's conditioned.
Yes,
There's
there are interpretations.
Right.
Some of those interpretations are not accurate.
There
and
are
we
new
find
points
out
of
by the results
creativity
of it.
within, just
Right.
like the mutation, just like the artist, just like Einstein.
I'm not sure what you're saying. Are you saying that we can both have a free will and not at the same time?
I think we may be asking the wrong question. Yeah. That depending on where we're pinning our labels, we're building artifacts here and arguing about whether they're true or not.
Okay. We make a decision. We make a choice, regardless of what it is. Okay. That choice can either be completely determined by previous events, circumstances, conditions, of which we're not, in control of at all, or not. Or not. So,
To the logical mind.
right. Well, all right. If we take it beyond the realm of logic, then what would be the reasoning? And I'm asking you a question actually that's kind of like.
I think the reasoning would actually, let's say, it would be a different skill set, because it might be just joy. Let's say Mark Rothko's painting a painting, and he's at that moment where is the stripe going to be orange or is it going to be red, right? And is there a need to put logic or some understanding of why he picks orange over red, whereas we could say whatever's going on there is a moment that doesn't have anything to do with logic, and it's a moment in what we're experiencing is just like joy or just being, or like you say, just consciousness, and we're not bringing the skill set of logic in, that it doesn't really apply there, or that we decide not to
But
apply.
if you look at the painting and study it and the history of painting, you may find a logic there.
Your pattern.
That the
you
painter
could, yes.
may not have been aware of at all.
Absolutely.
So I
again,
do believe there are significant patterns
Yeah,
and meta patterns
yeah.
that repeat
Right.
or reiterate.
Yeah. Well, now this is very interesting you bring this up. This is so crucial, because the whole fundamental thing about scientific inquiry is relating process and pattern. I'm so glad you brought that up. And what modern science differentiates is pattern and process are not the same thing. Pattern is a pattern. Process is something you have, is a narrative you've created that you infer from a pattern. And so that might have an implication on this discussion of free will, because you're talking about patterns. Did this happen?
All
Or
right,
did this? So,
let's-
and then whether or not there's free will is a decision about process.
And whose free will? That's where I think the self comes in. And I believe that the self is a semiotic process. It's about signs and the interpretations of signs and symbols. And each of us is a symbol. And that's where my work is. And you are a symbol. And you have symbols that you identify with and resonate with. And those metaphors, symbols, narratives, I believe, are crucial.
All right,
because
again,
if we don't pay attention to that.
We've got about a minute and a half left. It comes down to putting it to the test, to present, some decision that you could say was free of the constraints of causality, constraints of genetics, constraints of even the unconscious, which is like, active all the time. It never sleeps. So again, we can say that there might be a way of understanding that theoretically brings, the possibility of free will. But can we bring just one example and then describe exactly how that choice can be free of those compulsions?
Yeah. Well, I say this is interesting because you're asking, can anything act outside a system? And this brings up your question about consciousness. I mean, this is the big question. Probably the only thing that's possible to be free of the system is when people talk about awakened consciousness and what it's like to actually experience the totality in that type of experience. So this is rich indeed.
Okay. We have to end now, but actually as last point, then we would have to explore then how that evolution to an elevated consciousness could take place, because seemingly there would have to be reasons for that also. Okay, thank you,
Thank you very
Nomi,
much.
John, Kurt. That's all we have time for today.
Excellent.
Thanks. We'll be
Very
back
well
with
done,
other
George.
episodes.
Very well.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.